In this video from ITFreeTraining, I will look at how to use the Windows Disk Management tool. Using disk management, besides allowing basic disk management to be performed, also allows multiple disks to be combined together. This video will look at the basic features as well as the more advanced features of disk management. Without further ado, I will change to my Windows Server 2012 R2 server and look at how to use disk management. Disk management can be accessed a number of different ways. In this video, I will access it by right-clicking the Start menu and selecting Run. From here, I will enter in diskmgmt.msc. This will run the disk management tool in full screen. Running disk management in full screen allows more screen real estate to be used to show the disks in the system. Notice that disk 0 is currently displayed as a basic disk. Basic disks allow the least amount of features but offer the most compatibility with older operating systems, including alternative operating systems. A basic disk supports the ability to resize a volume, including the volume containing the operating system. In this case, the operating system is on this drive. To make a volume smaller, right-click the drive and select the option Shrink Volume. Once the window appears, the maximum amount the drive can be shrunk will appear. In this case, I will accept this value and press the Shrink button to start shrinking the drive. Notice that Windows will attempt to shrink the drive. However, an error message will appear informing us that there is not enough space available to complete the operation. Even though there is enough free space, the free space is not at the end of the drive. If this occurs, the drive needs to be defragmented so that all the free space is at the end of the drive. To defrag the drive, all you need to do is right-click on the drive, select the Properties, and then select the Tools tab. To defrag the drive, press the button Optimize. Defragging does take a long time to complete. In this case, I will not defrag the drive. Instead, I will go back and attempt to shrink the volume again. However, this time I will enter in the value to shrink the drive to 70,000 megabytes. Once I press Shrink, the drive will be shrunk down to a size of just over 30 gigabytes. Now that there is some free space at the end of the drive, I will right-click this free space and select the option New Simple Volume to launch the wizard. Once I'm past the welcome screen, on the next screen, I need to enter in how big I would like to make the partition. In this case, I will make it 10,000 megabytes and move on to the next screen. Next, I get the option to decide how the drive should be accessed. The top option allows me to select a drive letter. In this case, the drive letter has been automatically selected as drive E. Under this, you also have the option to mount the newly created volume to a folder. If you are not sure what you want to do yet, you can select the bottom option, which will leave the drive unassigned until the administrator assigns it later on. In this case, I will accept the default option and move on. On the next screen, I need to determine how the new volume will be formatted. In this case, I will change the volume label to Simple and accept the defaults and complete the wizard. Once the volume has been created, notice that when I right-click on the C drive, the option Extend Volume has been grayed out. The volume can no longer be extended because there is no free space after the volume. However, notice that after the volume that I just created, there is free space available. If I right-click on the E drive, notice the option Extend Volume is available. If I select this, the Extend Volume wizard will start. Once past the welcome screen, the maximum amount of space the volume can be extended will automatically be entered. In this case, I will change the value to 10,000 to expand the volume by 10,000 megabytes. To access additional features, the disk needs to be converted from basic to a dynamic disk. For example, mirroring a drive requires the disk to be dynamic. If I right-click the E drive, notice that I have the option Add Mirror. Once this option is selected, I will be prompted to choose, from the available disks in the system, which one to have the mirror created on. Notice that when the disk is added, you will get a warning message indicating that the disks will need to be upgraded to a dynamic disk in order to continue. Once I press Yes, both disks will be upgraded to dynamic disks automatically. Once the mirror drive has been created, the contents between the disks will be synced with each other to ensure both disks have the same information. A mirror volume requires the same amount of space on the second drive as what was in use on the first drive. As can be seen here, the rest of the free space on disk 1 has not been used. Even though it was not used for the mirror volume, the free space can be used for other volumes. Notice also the disk type has automatically been changed to dynamic. The synchronization process does take a while to complete, so I will pause the video and return shortly. When I created the mirror volume, the disk was automatically converted to a dynamic disk. If you want to convert a basic disk to a dynamic disk manually, right-click the disk and select the option Convert to Dynamic Disk. Windows will then give you the option to decide which disks to convert. In this case, I will only convert the second disk to a dynamic disk. The disk is now a dynamic disk. However, notice that if I right-click on the disk, I have the option Convert to Basic Disk. You will notice that if I right-click on disk 1, the option Convert to Basic Disk is grayed out. You will only be able to convert a dynamic disk to a basic disk if no volumes are present on the disk. Effectively, this means that if you want to convert a dynamic disk to a basic disk, all the data on the disk must first be removed. I will next look at a striped volume. A striped volume divides the data in the volume evenly between the number of disks in the striped volume. This gives good read and write performance, however, does not offer any redundancy, meaning if any drive in the striped volume was to fail, all data in the striped volume would be lost. To create a striped volume, all I need to do is right-click a free disk and select the option New Striped Volume to launch the wizard. Once past the welcome screen, on the next screen, I need to add the disks that I want to use. Notice that the amount of space usable with one disk is about 200 gigabytes. However, when I add the second drive, the total amount of space remains at 200 gigabytes. Further down, notice the amount of space that will be used on the drive I just added is 100 gigabytes. Striped drives require all disks to have the same amount of free space. If you have disks with different amounts of space, Windows will automatically reduce the amount of space used on each drive to the amount on the drive with the least amount of free space. For the rest of the wizard, I will accept the default and change the volume label to striped and perform a quick format. Once completed, Windows will inform me again that the disks will need to be converted to dynamic disks, which is a one-way process, and once I press Yes, the striped volume will be created. Notice that the striped volume has been created. It has been created on 2 disks with free space being left on the first disk. The free space was not able to be used due to the differences in drive sizes. In this case, I have used 2 disks. However, you are free to use 2 or more disks in a striped set. The important point to remember is that once you create the striped volume, you will not be able to add or remove disks from the striped volume. If I now scroll down, I will next create a RAID 5 drive by right-clicking on an empty drive and selecting the option New RAID 5 Volume. Once I'm past the welcome screen, on the next screen I need to select which disks I want to use in the RAID 5 volume. If I add a second disk, notice that the next option is grayed out. This is because RAID 5 volumes require at least 3 disks. If I add a 100 gigabyte disk, notice that once added, the amount of space that is usable on the disk is 50 gigabytes. Just like before with the striped volume, the amount of usable space on the drive has been reduced to the same amount as the disk with the least amount of free space. Notice the maximum amount of space is 100 gigabytes. Even though there are 3 drives with 50 gigabytes being used, totaling 150 gigabytes, one of the drives is lost to parity. This means RAID 5 can keep working after one drive has failed. I will now complete the wizard, accepting the defaults, except for changing the volume label to RAID 5 and making sure that Quick Format is ticked. I will get a message telling me that the disks will be converted to dynamic disks, to which I will press Yes when asked, and the RAID 5 volume will be created. Like the striped volume, notice that it needs to perform a resyncing, which will take a while to complete, so I will pause the video here and return shortly. Now that the RAID 5 drive has been synced, notice that it appears in disk management as a healthy G drive. Even after a single disk failure, the volume will still appear in Windows Explorer as G drive and be usable like any other drive. After creating all these volumes, notice that there is a lot of free space that is still present on multiple disks. In order to make use of this free space, I will right-click on some of it and select the option New Spanned Volume. Once I am past the welcome screen, on the next screen I will select all available disks and add them to the spanned set. Like before, I will accept all the defaults in the wizard except changing the label name to Spanned and making sure that the Quick Format option is ticked. Like before, once I complete the wizard, I will get a warning message that one of the drives will need to be converted to a dynamic disk. Once again, I will press Yes, and the spanned volume will be created. You will notice that the spanned volume has been created. Each of the different volumes is color-coded, making it easier to see them. At the bottom of disk management is the legend which shows which color belongs to each different type of volume. Although the striped and RAID 5 volume sizes cannot be changed once they are created, notice that if I right-click on Spanned Volume, I have the option to shrink the volume. Once I select the option, I am free to enter in a value. Notice that once I shrink the volume, the spanned volume has one disk in it, and the rest of the disks now have free space on them. In some cases, you may have a disk failure and the disk needs to be replaced. In the case of a mirror drive, if I right-click the drive, I have the option Remove Mirror. This option will effectively remove the mirror, creating two volumes with the same information on them. If you no longer require the mirror, this is the way to remove it cleanly. The next option down, Break Mirrored Volume, will break the relationship between the two drives. You would use this option in the event that a disk fails. Essentially, it does the same as Remove Mirror, however, it will ignore the fact that a drive is not present or failed. When I select this option, notice that I will get a warning message telling me that the mirror drive will no longer be redundant if I choose to break the mirror. Once I select Yes, the mirror will be removed, giving me two separate volumes. If you want to replace a failed disk, it will be just a matter of installing another disk and creating the mirror on that disk. To demonstrate how to replace a failed disk in a RAID 5 volume, I will remove a disk from the system. Notice that when the disk is removed, the RAID 5 volume will have an exclamation mark next to it, and the status is changed to Failed Redundancy. If I scroll down, notice that disk 4 is missing from the system, which is the first disk of the RAID 5 volume. If I open Windows Explorer, notice that even though a disk has failed, the drive is still working, and I'm able to create folders and files on the volume. I will now put a replacement disk in the system to replace the disk that I removed earlier. Notice that when the disk is put in the system, it comes up as a foreign disk. Any dynamic disk that was used in another Windows system, when it is introduced into a different Windows system, will come up as foreign. Before a foreign disk can be used, it needs to be imported. To do this, right-click on the disk and select the option Import Foreign Disks. In this case, Windows will detect that this disk is part of a disk group. If I press OK, notice Windows will report that the disk is part of a striped volume and the volume is incomplete. Once I press OK, Windows will give a warning stating that all the disks in the striped set are not present in the system. In this case, I know the volume is no longer being used and the disk is free to be used for something else. So I will press Yes and continue to import the disk into the system. Notice the disk has been imported and is now reported as failed since it is missing the other disks in the set. Even though the volume is incomplete, the disk still has data on it. This will need to be removed before it can be used to replace the failed drive in the RAID 5 volume. To do this, I will right-click on the volume, select Delete Volume, and then select Yes when prompted to confirm that I would like that data on the disk removed. If I now right-click on the RAID 5 volume, notice that I have the option Reactivate Volume. If a disk is having problems, but the problem has been corrected, for example, a faulty cable caused I/O problems that has been corrected, the Reactivate Volume will refresh the RAID 5 volume and put the disk back into operation. In this case, the disk has been removed, so I will instead need to select the option Repair Volume. Once I select this option, I need to select which disk will be used to replace the failed disk. Once I select the disk, I will receive the familiar message that the disk will be converted to dynamic. You may think it is strange that Windows displayed this message since seconds ago this disk was a dynamic disk. When you delete all the partitions on a disk, Windows will automatically change the disk to a basic disk. Once I press Yes, the disk will be added to the RAID 5 volume. Notice that once added, the RAID 5 volume will start syncing. Once complete, the RAID 5 volume will once again have redundancy. That covers it for using disk management in Windows. If you are interested in storage on Windows, you should also have a look at our other video on Windows Storage Spaces. Windows Storage Spaces is a new system in Windows allowing multiple disks to be combined. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have found this video informative. See you in the next video.